In the first half of today's lecture, we examined one potential set of implications of the current pandemic, focusing on the post-liberal order and the implications for some of the alternatives that we looked at. We saw that the R2P might not be as influential, depending on your view of international politics. There might be more conflict, more mass atrocities, again, depending on your view. And the case for war, economic sanctions, diplomacy, cyber might all shift. In the second half of today's lecture, we're going to focus on the second set of potential implications. These concern the question of prioritization. That is about how states should prioritize their various goals. John Rawls, the famous political philosopher that we've counted a few times on the course, suggests that political philosophy should take place in light of what's called moderate scarcity. This means that there are not quite enough resources to go around to do everything that we would like states to do. So we have to make tough decisions about which things to prioritize. We see this most clearly in the healthcare setting. Governments that spend even huge amounts on healthcare have to decide which measures they should prioritize. They can't maximize the lives of absolutely everyone. They need to decide, for instance, which drugs to purchase. There are very expensive drugs that can help very few people with their diseases, a very small number of people with disease, potentially in limited ways. This could use up large amounts of the health budget that, for instance, could not be used for other things that are potentially expensive, such as kidney dialysis or IVF treatment. So states have to prioritize their healthcare spending, even when they spend large amounts of money on healthcare. States also have to prioritize their foreign policy spending. For instance, the UK decides every year how it's going to spend its aid budget. It decides how much will go towards tackling global poverty, to tackling global health, tackling diseases, when tackling global health, tackling natural disasters, so on and so forth, development assistance. But this budget is limited, and so it has to decide which goals it's going to pursue. More generally, states have to decide not simply with their foreign policy spending, but which sorts of goals they want to pursue on the international agenda. Which sorts of things should they put significant resources into? Should they try to tackle climate change? Should they, for instance, focus on gender equality, plan for future pandemics, so on and so forth? It's not possible for each state to do absolutely everything. So again, they need to prioritize. Now, with COVID-19, and this gets us to the crux, it seems likely that states are going to have to prioritize a lot more. And this is for three reasons. First, given the huge economic damage caused by the pandemic, states are likely to have far fewer resources in the future to be able to spend on foreign policy goals. There won't be as much money to go around fulfilling international responsibilities. The budgets are going to be tighter. They're going to have to stretch the money even further and decide even more carefully. Second, as we saw in the first part of today's lecture, there might be many more situations to tackle. There might be many more mass atrocities, many more conflicts. So there will be a lot more things that need to be dealt with on a potentially smaller budget. Third, if some of the more pessimistic predictions about the post-liberal order come true, that we saw in the first part of today's lecture, there might be fewer states that are willing to do their bit to fulfill international responsibilities. There might be, for instance, fewer willing supporters of the R2P. The R2P group of friends, as they're called, might be far smaller. This would mean that any states that continue to support the R2P, say maybe Sweden, Holland, Ghana, so on and so forth, they would have to do a lot more to carry the burden, carry the can, picking up the slack from everyone else. Again, this means that there's more to be done. Smaller budgets, bigger problems, fewer states tackling the issue, willing to tackle the issue. So this highlights the question, then, how should states prioritize between various international responsibilities? This is particularly relevant for what we've been looking at in this module because it calls into question how we should conceive of the alternatives. So far, we've been focusing on other measures to address mass atrocities and serious external aggression, other measures apart from war. But we might conceive the alternatives to war as even broader than this. We might see the alternatives to war as alternatives to addressing mass atrocities and serious external aggression through conflict. So we might see development assistance to tackle global poverty as an alternative to war. Or we might see, for instance, addressing climate change as an alternative to war. So, which goals then should states prioritize? Let's focus on war first. Now, it might seem that the case for war is likely to be far weaker given this greater need to prioritize. In addition to the destruction and devastation, for instance, caused by recent wars, the war on terror, the war in Iraq, they were estimated to cost $5.9 trillion once pension funds and other long-term costs have been taken into account. These resources could have been used elsewhere to potentially reduce significantly deaths from preventable diseases globally, potentially saving millions of lives. Now, this consideration is what's called an opportunity cost, when you could potentially use resources elsewhere, but you choose not to. So does the fact that there was this opportunity cost, the money could have been used elsewhere, say to provide malaria nets, does this mean that the war on terror, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were problematic? Independent of all the other reasons for them. Problematic simply because these resources could have been used elsewhere. This is what we can call the opportunity costs objection to war. It says that, yes, wars are problematic because the opportunity costs of war are so great. War is so wasteful, the money could be better spent elsewhere. Two elements to this. The first compares threats. The thought is this: according to the World Health Organization, the WHO, the main cause of disease globally prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, I should add, is heart disease, which is 16.6% of all deaths, followed by stroke, 10.2% of all deaths, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 5.3%, lower respiratory infections, 5.2%. Many of these diseases are caused by easily preventable diseases such as measles, which can be cheaply vaccinated against, malaria, which mosquito nets can prevent, violence, which war reacts to. So violence, aggression is one form of violence. This only amounts to 2.6% of the annual global death toll. So it's tiny in comparison to all the other ways that people die globally every year. The first element of the opportunity costs then is this. It says that if states are likely, want to take seriously the most serious threats, the ones of the largest magnitude, focusing on violent conflicts rather than disease or poverty is unlikely to be justified. The second element of the opportunity cost objection is this. It concerns the justifiability of the sorts of measures that we're going to use to tackle the various threats. We've seen that war as a potential measure has got lots of potential problems. We saw this in lecture 2. We've seen that the argument for the alternatives to war seems like there's lots of other things that you can potentially do instead of going to war. We've seen, although there are debates about each of these as well. Yet it seems that tackling other threats, so tackling, for instance, disease and global poverty, many of these measures are actually pretty straightforward and don't involve such complicated ethical issues and are potentially very effective. So indeed, this objection runs, health interventions with regard to diarrhea, malaria, smallpox, and other forms of immunization have each saved more lives than if world peace had been secured, with at least 2.5 million deaths per year saved from each of these 4 interventions. So the thought on this second point is that the sorts of measures that you would use to tackle them could be very effective and don't face some of the major problems that we looked at with the alternatives, such as that war might do harm, sanctions can involve rally around the flag effect, so on and so forth. Now, one reply here is that it might be thought it's more important to tackle violence in order to promote stability and order in the long run. So the thought is that we need to have a peaceful society, which can then result in reductions in poverty and reductions in disease. Indeed, tackling mass atrocities may sometimes play an important role in addressing other issues, such as gender inequality and global poverty, to the extent that we need security before we can get development. But this might not necessarily undermine this opportunity costs objection. This is because poverty can lead to conflict, and so the best way of preventing violence might still be to tackle non-violent harms. In addition, disease kill in many states that are completely stable, but just very poor. And it's also going to be often very difficult to do much to address conflicts. What's more, even if one still holds that addressing violence should be prioritized, it's not clear that violence against others should be the prioritized focus. So even if you think it's really important to deal with violence in this order, the biggest violent killer is in fact self-harm, which resulted in 793,000 deaths in 2016. This might be that far more lives could be saved investing in global mental health than by any other response to violence. And even if one thinks still that violence against others should be prioritized, interpersonal violence is a far larger killer than what the WHO calls collective violence and international intervention. So, in other words, interpersonal violence, including domestic violence in particular, this is a far larger killer globally than wars and conflicts. Put some stats on that: 477,000 deaths compared to 184,000 deaths in 2016. 477,000 compared to 184,000 in 2016. So even if you think that violence should be prioritized, it might be that there should be greater campaigns for domestic disarmament, improving gender equality, campaigns against domestic violence, and ensuring improper accountability for interpersonal violence. So the opportunity cost objection says that when we're thinking about all these sorts of priorities that states should have, they shouldn't focus on war. They shouldn't use war as a measure. And more specifically, it says they shouldn't look to necessarily addressing mass atrocities, serious external aggression. It should focus on the most serious sorts of threats and the best sorts of measures. What then does this mean for thinking about which goals states should actually pursue more concretely? Should this, for instance, mean that states should prioritize global health over all other agenda? Or should they actually adopt a different view where they give some money towards global health, but also engage in lots of other things as well? Let's presume for a minute that states should focus on global health, given the WHO stats that I've already suggested imply that the biggest killers are global health issues rather than the war and mass atrocities. So let's assume that we should just put aside any other issues about, put aside the case for the alternatives to war. As we've been looking at, states shouldn't be investing in sanctions or diplomacy addressed at tackling mass atrocities or addressed at tackling aggression. Instead, they should invest in global health. Which sorts of global health issues should they focus on? Within the global health literature, there's big disagreements about how global health financing should be spent. Take malaria. Currently, 260 million people are infected each year and more than 440,000 die, approximately 70% of whom are under 5. Should states prioritize tackling malaria? Now, you might think this is the case if you think it's particularly important to save the lives of those who are under 5. Or take HIV and AIDS. Only 57% of people with HIV/AIDS are currently on antiretroviral drugs. Doing so could primarily help young adults. Should they be the focus instead? What about epidemic or pandemic preparedness? Should future spending go on tackling potential flu epidemics or other potential diseases that are zootonic, i.e. that come potentially from animals like coronavirus, like COVID-19? There was a report out in October by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that went through all the other potential diseases that we might face that could develop into another major serious global pandemic due to the loss of biodiversity. And they estimate that there are 1.7 million undiscovered viruses in animals, with over 500,000 that could potentially transfer to humans. It also estimates that there are 5 new diseases found in humans every year, each with potential pandemic possibility. That report emphasizes the problems of biodiversity and limits cutting down the biodiversity. Most commentators more generally think that in global health that it's only a matter of time before there is another serious flu pandemic. So we might think that it's really important that states address future pandemics. Or should states spend money on tackling what are called non-communicable diseases? Non-communicable diseases. What these are diseases that aren't transferred. They're diseases that aren't transferred between populations. They include things such as heart disease and cancer, primarily affect older people. Yet they're fast becoming the world's biggest killers, even in poorer countries. Yet they receive a tiny fraction of global spending on global health, and on some accounts could be tackled by relatively cheap measures. So lots of potential good causes within global health. How should we make decisions between these areas? Now, in the literature in global health, one of the standard ways of doing so is by invoking the numbers of live years saved by an intervention, by a measure. And these are called QALYs, Quality Adjusted Life Year. What this means is that when we're thinking about QALYs and the number of life years saved, so the number of good life years that you would have, say if you're 20 and your life expectancy is 80, and living 60 years of very good quality of life, then you've got 60 QALYs. If you're 80 and you've got a life expectancy of 10, but your quality of life will be very limited, say 50%, then you would have only 5 QALYs. Those in global health say we should prioritize QALYs. What this means is that diseases in the young are judged typically a lot worse than those that affect the old. When we use QALYs, we might think that focusing on global health more generally, given all the data that I presented from the WHO, this is by far the most important thing to do. We should just focus on saving lives, focus on saving young lives in particular. This brings us to some more fundamental questions. What are the basic sorts of things that we should value as an international community? Should we focus only on health? Some of those working in global health highlight it's important to prioritize what are called the social determinants of health. These include education, poverty relief, and gender equality. The argument is that these have a huge impact on individuals' health and more generally overall well-being. So take, for instance, where I live, which is one area of Manchester called Trafford, one area of the Greater Manchester. Now, we've all in Trafford got access to the NHS service, but in the north of the borough, which is far poorer, life expectancy is 10 years lower than it is in the very rich south of the borough. As you might expect, the north of the borough is much poorer and educational levels are lower. This is despite the fact that, as I've already said, there's equal access to healthcare through the NHS. And this picture is repeated all over the UK. Certain parts of the UK, such as Glasgow, life expectancy is particularly low. So the suggestion is that to help people live healthy lives, we need to do more than provide healthcare access and to tackle basic health issues. We need to tackle other social effects that have huge ramifications on health. This might mean that states should invest in education, poverty relief, and gender equality in order to help health over the longer term. In terms of thinking globally, it might mean that they should spend more of their foreign aid budgets, not on necessarily narrow programs of global health, narrowly understood, but on developing education systems abroad and on poverty relief, which can help in the longer term significantly improve health. The thought then is that we should focus on the social determinants of health. But even beyond global health, we might want to focus more fundamentally on other issues. Health is often seen as a basic good. Is something that we need to achieve our various goals. You need to be healthy. Political philosophers' standard lists, they put health as something that you need. We need to be healthy to live the lives that we want, to go on to have good jobs, to enjoy our families, to pursue hobbies, and so on. But there are lots of other things that we need for this as well. We've already seen that the social determinants of health are important for health. We might also think that these are important in themselves. We need education, poverty relief, gender equality, and so on to be able to live the life that we want. This is starting to get to the crux. So there's potentially an intrinsic value of education, poverty relief, gender equality, and so on, beyond any effects on global health. There might also be other intrinsic values that should potentially counterbalance any emphasis on health. And one in particular, you might think, is freedom to be able to enjoy our lives. The thought here is that we need our civil and political rights protected to be able to have good jobs, to enjoy our families, to pursue the hobbies that we want, and so on. So the suggestion isn't that we should say that health doesn't matter, but to say that we should have a much broader notion of well-being that includes within it civil and political rights. So the rights to vote, the rights to have freedom of expression, the rights for political participation. These are really important, the argument goes, given that people are willing to really value them so much. They go into resistant movements for us. They go to war over these questions. So we're concerned not simply with health, but also with education, poverty, and civil and political rights. And if that's right, then it might actually be far more important for states to address education, poverty relief, gender equality, not simply for health reasons, but for other reasons as well, because of the intrinsic value of them. And particularly relevant for what we've been looking at in this course, it might be relevant, it might be highly required of states to address civil and political rights. So required to address mass atrocities that violate civil and political rights, even if more lives could be saved elsewhere. This brings to an end today's lecture. In the first part of today's lecture, we focused on the potential implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for the post-liberal global order. We saw that this, depending on your view of the international system, might have major ramifications for the RTP, for warfare, particularly just war theory, as well as some of the other measures, including cyber warfare and economic sanctions. In part 2 of today's lecture, we've been looking at questions about prioritization. We've seen that the COVID-19 pandemic might highlight these questions to a greater extent as resources become even more stretched. We've then gone on to see how states should actually prioritize their various foreign policy agenda. One might think, if one endorses the opportunity cost objection, that war shouldn't be the priority. But if it's not war, what else? Global health seems a particularly potentially pressing priority given the numbers of lives at stake. But one might think that actually, rather than focusing on health narrowly, it should adopt a broader vision of health, takes into account the social determinants of health or other intrinsic considerations. And on that point, one might think that civil and political rights matter still a significant amount, and so this is a potentially way of still justifying military intervention and war and all the alternatives that we've been looking at in this module as well, that would aim to enforce civil and political rights. This brings to an end today's lecture. Thank you.